And it's always worth asking that question that was asked back in the New Wave era. What is so funny about peace, love, and understanding? Our next guest has been involved in the music industry and popular culture and politics for many years. He was a music journalist who made the transition to the business side of music in the late 60s. He was co-producer and co-director of the No Nukes movie in 1980. He's been involved in both music and politics for a long time. He has a book coming out called In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967 and the Hippie Idea, and he recently wrote a piece for The Nation about the 50th anniversary of the Human Be-In in San Francisco. Danny Goldberg, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Richard.
Good to talk to you. Hey, listen, I really enjoyed this piece in The Nation about the human being, which a lot of people think of as the sort of kickoff event of the hippie movement, at least as a pop culture phenomenon across the country, brought it to the world's attention. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it was certainly a turning point in the visibility. There's no exact date for when people, were growing their hair long and smoking dope and thinking of themselves as a hip subculture separate and apart from the beatniks. But the Be-In had about 30,000 plus people gathered in Golden Gate Park in near the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco. And that was 5 or 6 times more people than had ever gotten together for one of these hippie events. There'd been dances where local bands like the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin's band Big Brother and the Holding Company would play, but that was 3,000-4,000 people. So this dramatic quantum increase in the number of people identifying with that coincided with media interest, because Haight-Ashbury had kind of been developing as an alternative arty neighborhood for the previous 18 months. And it got international publicity because of the size of the crowds. And it set the stage for what later was called the Summer of Love, which wasn't an actual thing, but it was a media description of, the hippie culture in the Bay Area. So, yeah, to me, the Be-In was, and it was the beginning of 1967, so it was 50 years plus 5 days ago.
So, I'm always intrigued by the fact that, the combination of the media phenomenon, but then the underlying instincts that drive people to, that makes it resonate. So the hippie movement, as it was called by the media, I mean, I don't think anyone who was in it ever called it the hippie movement. And by the way, I'm a little younger. I was 13, but I remember reading about it and being anxious to get old enough to join it, which I did when I was 14. But go away from home and all that stuff. So there was a combination of, I think, a yearning on the part of a lot of young people. And then the fact that it was a very easy to grab onto human interest story for the media. Somehow those two things seem to intersect at a perfect moment in time to make this thing take off. You agree with that?
I do. I think, look, there's been a long history of esoteric philosophy. Bohemian culture was called in some eras, beat culture in the 50s. Other times it didn't have a name that I know, but that was interested in the study of spirituality outside of the context of organized religion, of a value system that wasn't purely materialistic or primarily materialistic. It often intersected with progressive political ideas, certainly intersected with pacifism, nonviolence. And over the decades, it had often involved what Tim Leary and other idealistic psychedelic journeyers called sacraments. For the Native American culture was peyote, and in the U.S., what happened in the early 1967 was some two gigantic energies collided with this long bohemian tradition. One of them was exactly as you said, the media, because the media then as now is in business to make money. The way they make money is by delivering audiences, and the audience that advertisers want. And the audience that advertisers wanted in 1967 and the late 60s, early 70s, that period that we call the 60s, were so-called baby boomers, because we and we're both broadly in that generation. We're part of what was then the biggest generation in history up until that point in the Western world. And younger people are more coveted by advertisers because we haven't decided on all of our brand preferences yet. And so the advertisers wanted to reach that audience. The media, therefore, wanted to reach that audience. And so this esoteric culture briefly became pop culture. And the other things that magnified it were the development of the modern rock and roll business, because it's when albums first started to become a real art form, and when radio stations, artists like Jimi Hendrix and Dylan, and people who didn't necessarily have hit singles that were on the top 40 stations, but this technology of FM radio was a new media that was able to gather tens of millions of people together. The mimeograph machine was just coming along, and so you had the ability to have these underground newspapers that were pretty inexpensive to put out. And then you had the criminalization of psychedelics, because LSD was legal in most places in the country until the end of 1966. In California, it became illegal on October 6th, 1966, which some mystics thought was a very cosmic 6-6-66. And you know what happens when you make things illegal? It's a lot easier to get them. When it was legal, you had to get it through universities or research facilities. Suddenly it was illegal, and you had the dope dealers making millions and millions of tablets of acid. So a combination of easily available illegal psychedelics, a mass media that was fascinated by this hippie culture that could give them good ratings or readership or things that their advertisers wanted, magnifying these esoteric ideas 100-fold, and that's what we call the 60s.
Yeah, I love that summary description, actually, Danny Goldberg, and I know you've got a book coming out on this. The other thing I'd say about LSD becoming illegal is that it added to the allure of the underground and the illegal culture. To live outside the law, you must be honest, as you all saw, which I don't think is true, by the way, but made for a good song lyric.
No. Unfortunately, we know that's not true.
Right, right. Donald Trump has proved that. But
better to be honest, but to say you must be honest to live outside the law, that is just delusional. The other thing is that there were political events happening in America's history that got intertwined with these things. And what fascinates me, because I wasn't cool enough I wasn't at the BN, I wasn't at most of the things I write about, but I was kind of in the front row as a teenager being influenced by them. And we're now into a situation where the war in Vietnam has exploded into this gigantic suction hose of hundreds of thousands of young men being drafted, and tens of millions subject to the military draft. And it was a war that, a lot of really smart people and everybody I respected thought had absolutely no moral value or political value in terms of America's interests. The combination of authority figures like the President of the United States and the main people in the media, and a lot of established religious figures supporting a war that really nobody could explain to people like me, plus making the fact that marijuana and LSD were illegal and could put you in jail, even though people could get vodka or prescription drugs. In those days, the big tranquilizer was Librium. It was not, Valiums weren't around yet. Just tremendously eroded the credibility of authority. And when people talk today about the crisis of authority and that people don't respect authority, it really started then. The decline of respect in authority figures of young people accelerated tremendously between the skepticism about the war and the irrationality of arresting people for getting high.
Yeah, there was another dimension also, I think, Danny, which is, you mentioned the war and the fact that for those of us who were young men at the time, our lives were at risk. We could be drafted and killed or come back, with terrible. This was a life and death situation. But on the other hand, we were in the middle of this enormous era of post-war prosperity. So there was also that kind of search for meaning that comes when you feel financially secure. So you both had the tremendous negative pressure of the war, and then what seems in retrospect to be, at least for large segments of society, largely white. You had this middle class, I think we were both middle class kids, but middle class kids in that day and age felt as a real thing the problem of searching for meaning, assuming that your basic physical needs are going to be taken care of. I imagine that's something that's unthinkable to generations that came later. But do you agree that that was a dimension of it as well?
Well, I think that questioning of materialism was central to the hippie idea. And I use that phrase, the hippie idea, because the symbols of hippie, the long hair and tie-dyed shirts and all of those symbols became drained of meaning very, very quickly because they became fodder for sitcom jokes and they were exploited by advertisers and so on. But behind the symbols was a search for a different value system. Organized religion, for most people, was not providing it. There were some exceptions, but for most people, you didn't get a spiritual experience. I went to synagogue. My parents were Jews. They weren't religious, but we went, and it seemed like a social organization. It didn't have a transcendent experience. On top of that, a lot of organized religion had rules about sexual behavior that were just inconsistent with the reality of being a teenager in the 60s. The birth control pill had come around a few years earlier, and we were not having any of that. So organized religion was associated with antiquated value system or with just sort of spiritless authoritarianism for a lot of people. There were exceptions in this religious world that I think had intense and beautiful spirit, but they were hard to find. I never found one. So there was a search, and then you had sort of this materialistic view, the Ayn Rand philosophy, which I still think is the dominant American religion, which is more is better, and you're defined by how much money you have and your external status. And, it's not that people didn't want to have a certain level of physical comfort. It's just that they didn't want to worship the idea of having the so-called, the phrase then was keeping up with the Joneses,
right.
Having a bigger car than your next door neighbor, having a better refrigerator than your next door neighbor. And that question of materialism is a very old conversation. It goes back to the ancient sermons of Jesus and the artists like William Blake. It was an old conversation, but it was a conversation that wasn't had on a mass stage before. Again, that intersection of the media interest in the culture and the other things going on. So
and
it was
I
also
feel
a
like
spiritual movement, and it was not a coincidence to me that in '67 you have the Beatles, who were the biggest stars in the world by any measurement at that time. They were hugely popular among young people all over the world, but just in terms of magazine covers, TV ratings, any metric that existed. And in terms of influence, because they were taken seriously by other artists and studied by other artists in a way that not all of today's pop artists are. And they became deeply interested in spirituality. They both, the members of the Beatles all acknowledged taking psychedelics by that time. Some of the music sounded it. And there was also an inquiry into Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. George Harrison is the best known for it, but Lennon also deeply interested. So, it was a spiritual journey for some people. Some people just wanted to party. Some people were just going along with the fashions. But the fashions were aiming in a more in kind of a spiritual direction. But at the same time, while this was happening, it was an extremely convulsive period in race relations in the United States.
Absolutely.
Because the civil rights movement had kind of been born. The modern civil rights movement, as we talk about it, was born in the mid-50s with Martin Luther King leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott. By 67, you'd had a civil rights bill passed, you'd had a voting rights bill passed, but there were still these tremendous pathology that we still deal with even today, of course, 50 years later, of 200 years of slavery and another 100 years of Jim Crow and racist patterns, both in housing, economics, and psychologically in all different parts of the society. And this was just around the time that people who used to call themselves Negroes were referring to themselves as black. Malcolm X had been killed a couple of years earlier, and there were new leaders like Stokely Carmichael who popularized the phrase Black Power, and the Black Panthers who emerged at this time. There were tremendous number of urban riots in 1967, the worst since the Civil War, dwarfing anything that happens now. And one of the reasons I wanted to write The Peace of the Nation was so many of my friends, and especially the younger people that I know, are terrified about what's going to happen with the new president. And it feels to many of them like this is just so much worse than anything that's ever happened before. And we don't know what the future holds. It may be worse. We don't know. But
well,
boy,
what we're going to have to do, I think, going forward, Danny, unfortunately, we've only got about 30 seconds left. But first of all, two-part question. And again, only 30 seconds, unfortunately. But one, any lessons you think from this movement for today? And that's a lousy question to only give you 30 seconds for. And two, when does the book come out?
Well, to the extent that the left cannot fight with each other and can find common ground to fight for broad principles, that's what killed so much of progressive politics. The book comes out on June.
Okay. Well, perfect. Yeah. So Danny Goldberg, author of the upcoming book, The Lost Chord, 1967 and the Hippie Idea, and A Peace in the Nation about the human being. Great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Richard. It's so great to hang out with you. Bye-bye.
Same here, man.